In a weathered workshop on the outskirts of Sacramento, time stands still among the ghosts of classic cars. Frank Morrison's weathered hands move with practiced precision over the faded blue paint of a '67 Mustang, each touch a conversation with the past. For 40 years, he's breathed life back into forgotten machines, finding peace in the symphony of socket wrenches and the scent of motor oil. But this Mustang is different. Something about its curves, its character, reminds him of summer nights and promises whispered under starlit skies. He doesn't know it yet, but the woman who will walk through his door tomorrow isn't just another client with a restoration project. She's Catherine Wells, the girl who stole his heart in '69, now a tech industry titan worth billions. Her return will prove that some engines, like some loves, never truly stop running. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filters through the dusty windows of Morrison's classic auto restoration, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. Frank adjusts his well-worn shop apron, the fabric softened by decades of use and countless washings, each grease stain a memory of some car brought back to life under his care. The workshop smells of metal and history, a combination that's become as natural to him as breathing. At 68, Frank moves with the deliberate grace of someone who knows every tool's weight, every machine's rhythm. His silver hair catches the light as he bends to examine the Mustang's chrome bumper, his reflection distorted in its surface. The car had arrived last week, dropped off by a corporate transport service with paperwork bearing only a company name: Wells Innovations. From his workbench, he retrieves a small journal, leather-bound, its pages yellow with age. Inside, he keeps meticulous records of every restoration he's ever done. Some mechanics use computers now, but Frank believes in the permanence of pen and paper. The feel of writing each detail grounds him in the reality of the work. The bell above the shop door chimes, and Maria from the coffee shop next door enters, carrying his usual morning order. The ritual hasn't changed in 15 years, not since her father first opened the place. "Morning, Mr. Morrison," she calls out, setting the large cup on his workbench. "Still fighting with that old beauty?" Frank straightens, his knees protesting slightly. "She's not fighting, Maria, just being particular about how she wants to be treated." He reaches for his wallet, but Maria waves him off. "Dad says it's on the house. Says you fixed his Chevy for parts cost last month." Frank accepts with a nod, knowing better than to argue with the family's generosity. As Maria leaves, he pulls open the top drawer of his tool chest, revealing a worn Polaroid. Tucked beneath his precision tools, Eleanor smiles up at him from the faded image, perched on the hood of their own Mustang back in '75. His late wife had always understood his love affair with these machines. The photo goes back in its place, but the memories linger as he sips his coffee and begins his morning inspection. This Mustang needs everything: engine rebuild, interior overhaul, bodywork, the works. It's the kind of project he lives for, the kind that requires equal parts technical skill and artistic vision. Running his hand along the car's fender, Frank feels the story beneath the paint. Every classic car carries its history in dents and scratches, in the wear patterns of the seats, in the subtle modifications made over decades of ownership. This one speaks of long drives and careful maintenance, of sunsets and rainstorms, of moments that shaped lives. He settles onto his rolling stool, wheels himself under the chassis, and clicks on his work light. The undercarriage tells its own tale: original parts where possible, thoughtful repairs where necessary. Whoever owned this car understood its value beyond mere transportation. The morning light strengthens, warming the workshop. Frank loses himself in the familiar rhythm of inspection and documentation. He notes every detail in his journal: the matching numbers on the engine block, The slightly worn shift linkage, the original radio still nestled in the dash. Time moves differently here, measured in quarter turns of bolts and the slow transformation of rusted metal to gleaming chrome. Frank checks his watch, almost 9. Soon the phone will ring with his daughter's daily call, checking in on him. As she drives to her law office, she worries too much, but he understands. Since Eleanor passed 3 years ago, their morning conversations have become as much a part of his routine as the coffee and the work itself. He takes another sip from his cup, now cooling, and studies the Mustang's profile. Something about this car tugs at his memory, like a word on the tip of his tongue. Maybe it's just that it's the same model year as the one he drove in his youth, the one he sold to buy Eleanor's engagement ring. But no, there's something else, something in the custom touches and the particular shade of blue. The mystery will have to wait. Frank pulls on his work gloves. Their leather as familiar as a handshake from an old friend. There's work to be done, and in the doing of it, he'll learn what this car has to tell him. The phone rings precisely at 9:15. Frank wipes his hands on a shop rag and reaches for the landline he refuses to replace with anything newer. His daughter, Sarah's voice comes through clear and familiar. "Morning, Dad. How's the shop?" "Today, quiet." Frank settles onto his office chair, a leather piece Eleanor picked out 20 years ago. "Got that Mustang taking up most of my attention." "The corporate job?" There's a hint of concern in Sarah's voice. She's always worried about him taking on too much, especially since the hip replacement last year. "You're not pushing yourself too hard, are you?" Frank glances at the stack of classic car magazines on his desk, their pages dog-eared and worn. The latest issue sits open to an article about 67 Mustang restorations. "I know my limits, sweetheart. Besides, this one's special." "You say that about all of them." "Because they all are." He smiles, knowing she can hear it in his voice. "How's Tommy doing with his college applications?" "Stressed. He's got his heart set on Stanford engineering." Sarah pauses, and Frank can picture her navigating morning traffic. "You should come over for dinner this weekend." He'd love to hear about your apprenticeship days. Before Frank can answer, the shop door opens. Bill Henderson, his parts supplier of 30 years, walks in carrying a cardboard box. "Got to go, honey. Bill's here with some parts. Love you." "Love you too, Dad. Don't forget about dinner." Bill sets the box on the counter, his round face flushed from the effort. "Morning, Frank. Found those original radio knobs you were looking." 4. Guy in Fresno had a whole set. Frank opens the box, examining the chrome pieces. They're perfect, exactly what the Mustang needs. "Bill, you're a miracle worker. What do I owe you?" "Add it to the monthly tab." Bill leans against the counter, eyeing the Mustang. "That's a beauty. Reminds me of the ones we used to work on back in the day. Remember that blue one, summer of '69? Frank's hands pause over the parts. "Lot of blue Mustangs back then." "Sure, but this one," Bill squints at the car. "Something about that custom trim. Wasn't there a girl who used to bring one in? What was her name?" "Catherine," Frank says quietly, surprising himself. "Catherine Wells." Bill snaps his fingers. "That's right. She was always hanging around that summer, watching you work. Whatever happened to her?" Frank shrugs, but his mind fills with images. A young woman in a summer dress sitting on a workbench, asking intelligent questions about engine timing and valve clearances. Life happened. People move on. The morning continues with its familiar rhythm. Frank answers calls about potential projects, declines 3 because his schedule's full through spring. He takes his lunch at his desk, reviewing restoration guides and making notes in his journal. Mid-afternoon brings Tommy Martinez's Chevelle in for a tune-up. The kid's only 20, but he has a genuine appreciation for classic cars. Frank's been mentoring him informally, teaching him the skills that modern mechanics sometimes overlook. "Mr. Morrison," Tommy calls from under the Chevelle, "I think I found your oil leak. Valve cover gasket's shot." Frank wheels over on his stool, shining his light where Tommy points. "Good eye, what's your plan?" Remove the cover, clean the mating surfaces, new gasket with a thin bead of RTV on both sides. Tommy's voice carries a hint of uncertainty, seeking approval. Perfect. Tools are in the top drawer. Show me how you'd do it. Watching Tommy work, Frank feels a familiar satisfaction. The boy has natural talent, the kind that can't be taught. He reminds Frank of himself at that age. Eager to learn, respectful of the machines, understanding that every car has its own personality. The afternoon light slants through the windows, turning the dust motes golden. Frank returns to the Mustang, opening one of his reference books to compare paint codes. The original color is still visible in the door jamb, Acapulco blue, but with a custom pearl that made it shimmer in certain lights. He remembers ordering that exact mix, summer of '69. Remembers Catherine's smile when she saw it. The way she said it reminded her of the ocean at sunrise. The memory comes with a clarity that surprises him, like opening a door he thought had been locked forever. The shop phone rings again, startling him from his reverie. It's his supplier in Oakland, confirming tomorrow's parts delivery. Frank makes notes in his calendar, the same leather-bound book he's used for years. Eleanor always teased him about his resistance to digital planning. But these pages hold more than just appointments. They hold the story of his life in oil changes and tune-ups, in restorations and relationships built over decades of honest work. The work order arrives by courier the next morning, sealed in a crisp envelope bearing the Wells Innovations logo. Frank slits it open with his pocket knife, the same one Eleanor gave him on their 20th anniversary. Inside, the paperwork is all modern efficiency, digital fonts and corporate letterhead, but it's the signature at the bottom that catches his eye. C. Wells, CEO. He sets the form on his workbench, next to his coffee cup. The name shouldn't mean anything. Wells is a common enough surname, and the C could stand for anything, but his hands aren't quite steady as he picks up his reading glasses for a closer look. The phone interrupts his examination. Morrison's classic auto restoration. Mr. Morrison? The voice is professionally crisp, female. I'm calling from Wells Innovations regarding the '67 Mustang. Ms. Wells would like to schedule a consultation about the restoration parameters. Frank's throat tightens slightly. Of course. I'm usually here from 7 to 6, Monday through Saturday. Tomorrow at 10 would suit Ms. Wells's schedule. Would that work for you? He glances at his calendar, though he already knows it's clear. That would be fine. After hanging up, Frank walks slowly around the Mustang. Now that he's looking, he can see the signs he missed before. The slight modification to the hood scoop, the custom angle of the side mirrors, details he himself had suggested lifetime ago. The bell chimes, and Mike Randall walks in. They've been friends since high school, when they both worked at the Texaco station on Palmer Street. Mike's retired now, but he still stops by most afternoons to talk cars and share gossip. You look like you've seen a ghost, Mike says, settling into his usual chair by the workbench. Frank hands him the work order. Take a look at this. Mike adjusts his bifocals, scanning the document. His eyebrows rise slowly. Wells Innovations? That tech company up in Silicon Valley? He whistles, low. They say the CEO's worth billions. What's she want with... He stops, looking at Frank. Wait a minute, Wells. You don't think... I don't know what to think. Frank picks up a wrench, more for something to hold than any real purpose. Could be coincidence. Hell of a coincidence. Mike leans back, studying his friend. When's the last time you even heard from Catherine? 69, right after she left for college. Frank sets the wrench down carefully. Got a letter about a month later, said she was sorry, but she had to focus on her future. That was it. Mike shakes his head. And now she's running one of the biggest tech companies in the world. Read about her in Forbes last month. Self-made billionaire, revolutionary AI development, something about quantum computing. He pauses. Never married, according to the article. Frank turns to the Mustang, running his hand along its fender. The metal is cool under his palm, solid, real. None of that matters. This is just another restoration job. Sure it is. Mike's voice carries decades of friendship, of knowing when not to push. Want me to stick around tomorrow? I could just happen to be here at 10. No, Frank's voice is firm. Whatever this is, I need to handle it myself. After Mike leaves, Frank pulls out his restoration notes. The pages are filled with his careful documentation, measurements, part numbers, observations about wear patterns, and needed repairs. But now he adds another note, one that has nothing to do with the technical aspects of the job. Original owner, Catherine Wells, unconfirmed. Summer 1969, custom paint, modified hood scoop, adjusted mirror angle. He stares at the words until they blur slightly. Tomorrow at 10, he'll know for sure. Until then, there's work to be done. He forces himself to focus on the tangible. The gentle curve of the body panels, the precise fit of the chrome trim, the mathematical certainty of torque specifications. But as the afternoon light fades, he finds himself remembering things he thought he'd forgotten. The sound of her laugh, the way she could diagram an engine's electrical system from memory, the dreams they'd shared about opening their own shop someday. She'd had such plans, such drive. Maybe that's why she'd left. The small dreams of a small-town mechanic couldn't compete with the future she saw for herself. Frank closes his journal and begins his evening routine. Tools cleaned and put away, floors swept, lights checked. Tomorrow will come soon enough. Whatever happens at 10 o'clock, he'll face it with the same steady patience he brings to every restoration. After all, that's what he does. He fixes things, brings them back to life, makes them whole again, even if some things, he knows, can never truly be restored to what they once were. At 9:45, Frank finds himself adjusting tools that don't need adjusting. The morning sun fills the workshop, making the Mustang's faded paint glow with hints of its former glory. He's changed his shirt twice already, finally settling on a clean blue work shirt with his name embroidered on the pocket, professional but authentic. The sound of tires on gravel comes at 9:58. Frank moves to the window, watching a sleek black Tesla pull into the lot. A woman emerges from the back seat, elegant in a tailored charcoal suit. Large designer sunglasses hide her eyes. But there's something in the way she carries herself, something in the tilt of her head as she studies the building's facade that makes his heart skip. The bell chimes at precisely 10 o'clock. Frank turns from the window, wiping his palms on his pants. She stands in the doorway, a silhouette against the morning light. For a moment, neither of them speaks. Then she removes her sunglasses and, 50 years, collapse into nothing. Her hair is silver now, styled in an expensive cut, but her eyes are the same deep brown he remembers, still sharp with intelligence and curiosity. "Hello, Frank." Her voice is lower than he remembers. Refined by years and success, but still unmistakably hers. "Catherine." He's proud of how steady his voice sounds. "You're looking well." A smile touches her lips. "You haven't changed a bit." It's not true, of course. They've both changed in countless ways. But something in the workshop's atmosphere, the familiar sense of oil and metal, the soft tick of cooling engines, makes it easy to pretend just for a moment that they're still those young people who once dreamed together over engine diagrams and paint swatches. "The car's over here," Frank says, falling back on professional courtesy. "I've done a preliminary inspection." Catherine follows him to the Mustang, her heels clicking on the concrete floor. She reaches out, running one manicured hand along the car's fender, and Frank notices she's wearing the same shade of blue nail polish she favored all those summers ago. "You kept her running all these years," he says quietly. "I tried." She turns to face him. "But some things need an expert's touch. That's why I'm here." There's weight to her words, meanings that hover just below the surface. Frank focuses on the technical, the safe. The engine needs a complete rebuild. Bodywork too, though the frame's solid. Interior's original but worn. 3 to 4 months of work minimum. I know. Catherine moves around the car slowly, her gaze taking in every detail. That's why I brought her to you. You always understood her quirks. Frank watches her complete her circuit of the car. Why now, Catherine? She pauses, one hand resting on the hood. The company's going public next month. Big changes coming. Made me start thinking about preservation. Some things shouldn't be lost to time. Some things are already lost. The words come out before he can stop them. Catherine meets his gaze directly. Are they? Before he can respond, the door chimes again. A young woman in a business suit hurries in, tablet in hand. Ms. Wells, your 10:30 video conference. Reschedule it, Angela. Catherine doesn't look away from Frank. And hold my calls for the next hour. Mr. Morrison and I have some restoration details to discuss. After the assistant leaves, Catherine removes her suit jacket, draping it carefully over a nearby chair. The gesture is so familiar. She used to do the same thing with her denim jacket all those years ago that Frank has to look away. I need to know something, she says softly. That summer after I left, did you ever open the glove compartment? Frank shakes his head. The car was gone before I came in that morning. Your father said you'd left for Stanford early. Catherine moves to the passenger side, reaches through the window, and pulls the glove compartment latch. It opens with a soft click. Inside, yellowed, with age but perfectly preserved, is an envelope. I wrote you a letter, she says, taking it out. Tried to explain everything. I came by at dawn to leave it, but I couldn't do it, couldn't face making it real. So I hid it here, told myself if it was meant to be, you'd find it. Frank takes the envelope. His name is written on the front. In Catherine's precise handwriting, the ink faded but legible. He doesn't open it. Would it have changed anything? He asks. Catherine looks at him, and for a moment her carefully maintained facade cracks, showing the girl she used to be. I don't know, but you deserved an explanation. You deserved better. Frank places the letter carefully on his workbench. We all did what we thought was right at the time, did we? Catherine's voice is barely a whisper. Because I've achieved everything I set out to do, built something bigger than I ever dreamed possible. But sometimes, late at night, I still find myself thinking about that summer, about the path not taken. The morning light streams through the windows, catching the dust motes in its beam, making them dance like memories given form. In the silence that follows, the Mustang sits between them, both barrier and bridge, to a past they've never fully left behind. Frank sets about preparing the paperwork, grateful for the mundane task. His hands move automatically through the familiar forms, while Catherine examines the car's interior. The letter sits untouched on his workbench, a time bomb in cream-colored stationery. The upholstery's original, Catherine notes, running her hand along the driver's seat. I remember picking this shade of... She stops suddenly, reaching between the seat and center console. Well, this is certainly a blast from the past. She withdraws a small piece of paper, faded to sepia with age. Frank recognizes it immediately. A ticket stub from the Starlight Drive-In, dated July 15th, 1969. Easy Rider, Catherine reads, smiling. You said it would inspire me to hit the open road. As I recall, you weren't impressed. Frank finds himself smiling too. Said Peter Fonda had the wrong approach to freedom. Freedom isn't about running away, Catherine quotes herself, then pauses. I spent years telling myself that's not what I did. Frank moves closer to examine the stub. Their fingers brush as she hands it to him, a contact that sends echoes of memory coursing through his mind. The humid summer night, the movie flickering. On the massive screen, Catherine's hand finding his in the darkness. The drive-in's a housing development now, he says, carefully placing the stub beside the letter. Progress, they called it. Everything changes. Catherine turns back to the car. Except this, she's exactly as she was that summer, right down to that little dent in the dashboard. Frank chuckles, despite himself. From when you tried to install the new radio yourself. I was sure I could figure it out. Her eyes meet his, sharing the joke. You didn't say, "I told you so." Just showed me how to do it properly. You were a quick study, always were. Frank pulls out his restoration notebook. Speaking of the radio, I've sourced original replacement knobs. Bill found them in Fresno. Catherine nods, professional mask slipping back into place. What else do you need? They spend the next hour going over the restoration plan in detail. Frank outlines the work required: engine rebuild, bodywork, interior restoration. Catherine asks intelligent questions, demonstrating that she hasn't forgotten everything she learned in his workshop all those years ago. The paint, she says finally. Can you match it? The exact shade? Acapulco blue with custom pearl coat. Frank doesn't need to check his notes. I remember the mix. Something flickers in Catherine's eyes. Of course you do. You never forget the important details. Part of the job. He closes his notebook. 4 months, give or take. I'll need to order some specialty parts. Money's no object. She waves away his estimate sheet. Just make her right again. The morning sun has climbed higher, streaming through the windows and catching the silver in their hair. In this light, Frank can see both the girl she was and the woman she's become, like double exposure in an old photograph. About the letter, Catherine begins. Leave it, Frank says gently. Some things are better left in their time. She studies him for a long moment. Are you happy, Frank, with how things turned out? He thinks of Eleanor, of their 35 years together, of Sarah and young Tommy with his budding mechanical skills, of the thousands of cars he's brought back to life, each one a story, a piece of history preserved. I've had a good life, he says simply. Different than we planned that summer, but good. Catherine's assistant appears in the doorway again, hovering anxiously. This time, Catherine acknowledges her with a small nod. I have to go. Board meeting. She reaches for her jacket, then hesitates. I'd like to check on the progress personally, if that's all right. Not through assistants or video calls. Shop's open 6 days a week. Frank keeps his voice neutral. You know where to find me. Catherine slips her sunglasses back on, but not before he catches something that might be regret in her eyes. I do now. She pauses at the door, looking back at the Mustang. You know, I almost sold her many times, but something always stopped me. Some things we hold on to, Frank says, even when we're not sure why. After she leaves, Frank stands in the quiet workshop, surrounded by the ghosts of memory. The ticket stub and letter remain on his workbench, twin artifacts of a summer long, impassed. Outside, he can hear Catherine's Tesla pulling away, carrying her back to her world of corporate meetings and billion-dollar decisions. He picks up his wrench. There's work to be done, and in the doing of it, perhaps some form of restoration. That has nothing to do with cars and everything to do with time's long arc bending back upon itself. The contract arrives the next morning via courier, 15 pages of legal language that turns art into obligation. Frank reads it carefully at his desk, coffee growing cold beside him. The terms are more than generous, with a blank line where the final price should be. To be determined by service provider, it reads, followed by Catherine's elegant signature. Sarah calls while he's still reviewing the paperwork. You're late for our morning check-in, she says. Everything okay? Frank glances at the clock, surprised to see it's almost 10. Just got caught up in some paperwork. The Mustang job. The corporate one. There's a pause. Dad, is something going on? You sound different. He considers telling her everything about Catherine, about their history, about the letter that still sits unopened on his workbench. Instead, he says, just a complicated restoration. Lot of custom work. Well, don't let them take advantage of you. These tech companies have more money than sense sometimes. I know how to handle myself, sweetie. Frank signs the contract, his signature looking plain next to Catherine's flowing script. How about you come by the shop later? I could use your legal eye on something. Sarah arrives during her lunch break, dressed in a suit that reminds Frank of Catherine's, though he pushes that thought away. She reads the contract with her professional focus, marking sections with a yellow highlighter. This is unusually comprehensive, she says finally. Their lawyer really worked to protect you. Full creative control, materials at cost, plus 20%, no completion deadline. She looks up. Who exactly is this client? Frank busies himself with his tool chest. Wells Innovations, the tech company. Wait, Catherine Wells, the Catherine Wells? Sarah sets down the contract. Dad, she's one of the most powerful women in tech. What's she doing bringing a car to your shop? Best restoration work in Sacramento, he says lightly. Word gets around. Sarah's eyes narrow. She's always been too perceptive, just like her mother. There's something you're not telling me. Just history, Frank says quietly. Ancient history. Before Sarah can press further, the shop phone rings. It's Catherine's assistant confirming the parts budget and requesting weekly progress reports. Frank puts the call on speaker, letting Sarah hear the corporate machinery in motion. Ms. Wells would like to schedule her first progress inspection for next Saturday, the assistant says. Would 9 a.m. suit? Frank catches Sarah's raised eyebrow. Saturday's fine. After the call, Sarah crosses her arms. Monthly inspections are standard for high-end restorations. Weekly is personal. Sarah? Dad. Her voice softens. Mom's been gone 3 years. If there's something or someone, it's not like, oh, that. Frank picks up the contract. This is business, pure and simple. Sarah hugs him, and he catches a whiff of Eleanor's favorite perfume, their daughter's way of keeping her mother close. Okay, but I'm here if you need to talk. After she leaves, Frank begins the real work. He photographs every inch of the Mustang, documenting its current condition. The camera catches details his eyes missed. A small heart carved almost invisibly into the bottom corner of the passenger window. The faint remains of a Stanford parking sticker on the bumper. He's under the car, checking the transmission, when he hears the door chime. Catherine walks in, more casual today in slacks and a silk blouse, but still radiating corporate authority. I know I said Saturday, she says, not quite apologizing. But I had a meeting cancel and I thought... Frank slides out from under the car, wiping his hands. No need to explain. It's your car. You've started the documentation. She moves to his workbench, examining the photos. You still use film. Digital's fine for most things, but with restorations, he shrugs. Film catches the soul of a car better. Catherine picks up a photo of the carved heart, and Frank sees her fingers tremble slightly. I'd forgotten about this. Julie dared me to do it, said it would make it truly mine. Julie Harrison, Frank remembers. She married that accountant from Modesto. She did. They have grandchildren now. Catherine sets down the photo. We still exchange Christmas cards. She asks about you sometimes. The silence that follows feels heavy with unspoken words. Frank reaches for his toolbox, needing something solid to hold on to. I should let you work, Catherine says finally. I'll come back Saturday, officially. As she turns to leave, Frank calls after her. The heart. Do you want me to remove it when I restore the window? Catherine pauses at the door. No, she says softly. Some marks we should keep. They're part of the story. Frank spends the next few days methodically dismantling the Mustang's interior. Each piece is catalogued, photographed, and stored with the precision of an archaeologist. He's done this hundreds of times before, but never with such a persistent sense of excavating his own past. The discovery comes on Thursday afternoon. He's removing the rear seat cushion when his hand brushes against something that shouldn't be there. A slight irregularity in the upholstery. Decades of experience. Tell him this isn't factory standard. Using a small flashlight, he examines the area more closely. There's a seam that's been carefully re-sewn, nearly invisible unless you know what to look for. Frank retrieves his tools and with surgical care opens the stitching. Inside the seat back, wrapped in plastic, is a bundle of letters. His hands aren't quite steady as he pulls them out. The envelopes are yellowed with age, but the handwriting is unmistakable, his own, from all those summers ago. Letters he'd written to Catherine after she left, each one returned unopened. The bell chimes. Frank turns to see Catherine standing in the doorway, her face pale. "I forgot about those," she says quietly. "I thought I'd taken them out years ago." Frank holds the bundle carefully. "You kept them." "I couldn't bring myself to throw them away." She moves closer, designer heels clicking on concrete. "And I couldn't bear to read them. Why hide them in the car?" Catherine reaches out, touches one of the envelopes. "Because this was the only place where everything made sense, where it could keep everything safe." Tommy's voice suddenly carries through the open door. "Mr. Morrison, you've got a call." He stops short, sensing the tension. "Sorry, I'll come back." "No," Frank says, grateful for the interruption. "Take a message, Tommy, and show me how that valve adjustment's coming along." Catherine steps back, professional mask sliding back into place. "I should go. My assistant's probably having a meltdown over my empty schedule." "Catherine," Frank holds out the letters. "These belong to you." She shakes her head. "Keep them. Maybe," she pauses at the door, "maybe someday we'll both be ready to read them." After she leaves, Tommy approaches cautiously. "Everything okay, Mr. Morrison?" Frank tucks the letters into his toolbox. "Sometimes old cars have secrets, kid. Part of the job is knowing which ones need to be brought to light and which ones should stay hidden. That was her, wasn't it? The tech billionaire everyone's talking about." Tommy's eyes are wide. "The news said she's worth like 20 billion or something." Frank picks up a wrench, needing its familiar weight. "She's just a client, Tommy. Now about that valve adjustment." But later, after Tommy leaves, Frank finds himself sitting at his workbench, staring at the bundle of letters. He remembers writing each one, the first full of confusion and hurt, the later ones with growing acceptance, and, finally, a kind of peace. He'd poured his heart into those pages, never knowing they'd end up hidden away in the very car that had brought them together. The shop phone rings, startling him. It's Catherine's assistant, sounding flustered. "Miss Wells wondered if you might be available for dinner. To discuss the restoration progress, of course. She has a private room reserved at Laurent's." Frank looks at the letters, then at the half-dismantled Mustang. "Tell her I appreciate the offer, but I've got work to do here. She's welcome to stop by the shop tomorrow. I'll order from the diner down the street." There's a pause, then Catherine's voice comes on the line. "The diner's fine, Frank. 7 o'clock. Bring your appetite for grilled cheese. Some things haven't changed around here." After hanging up, Frank returns to the Mustang. The hidden compartment reveals one final surprise, a small notebook, its pages filled with Catherine's neat handwriting, technical notes about the car, maintenance records, but also fragments of thoughts, dreams, scribbled in margins. One page. Catches his eye. "F showed me how to adjust the timing today. Says it's all about patience, about listening to the engine's rhythm. Wonder if he knows I'm really listening to his voice, watching his hands move with such certainty. Wonder if he knows I'm falling." Frank closes the notebook gently. Tomorrow, they'll share a simple dinner and talk about carburetors and paint choices. They'll maintain their careful professional distance. But for now, he allows himself to remember that summer, when every lesson was an excuse to spend time together, when the future seemed as wide open as the California sky. He returns the notebook to its hiding place. Some discoveries need time to be understood, like old paint revealed under layers of newer coats. The trick is knowing when to keep, scraping, and when to let the layers tell their own story. The first sign of trouble comes via Sarah's morning call. "Dad, have you seen Twitter?" Frank cradles the phone against his shoulder as he sorts through a box of chrome trim pieces. "You know I don't mess with that stuff. Someone posted a photo of Catherine Wells at your shop. It's going viral." Sarah's voice carries a mix of concern and disbelief. The caption says, "Tech titan Catherine Wells slums it at local mechanic. Guess even billionaires get nostalgic." Before Frank can respond, he hears cars pulling into the lot. Looking through the window, he sees 2 news vans, reporters already unfolding equipment. "I'll call you back, honey." He hangs up just as the first reporter reaches his door. "Mr. Morrison!" Can you confirm that Catherine Wells has brought her car to your shop? Is it true you knew her before she founded Wells Innovations? Frank holds up his hands. No comment. This is a private business. But social media moves faster than denials. By noon, 3 different tech blogs have run stories speculating about Catherine's mysterious connection to a Sacramento auto shop. One enterprising reporter has even dug up a high school yearbook photo of them at prom. His landline hasn't stopped ringing. He finally unplugs it when a morning show tries to book him for an interview. The cell phone Sarah insisted he carry buzzes with texts from old friends who've seen the news. The bell chimes, and Frank looks up expecting another reporter. Instead, it's Catherine's assistant, Angela, looking harried. "Ms. Wells sent me to handle this," she says, tablet in hand. "Our PR team is preparing a statement, something about supporting local businesses and the importance of historic vehicle preservation. They'd like your approval." The bell chimes again. Catherine strides in, ignoring the cameras visible through the windows. She's wearing a simple black dress that probably costs more than Frank's monthly rent, but her face shows genuine concern. "I'm so sorry about this, Frank. I should have been more careful." "Not your fault." He wipes his hands on a shop rag. "Though I admit I didn't expect to see my prom picture on the internet today." A ghost of a smile crosses her face. "You were very handsome in that powder blue tuxedo, and you were beautiful in that silver dress." The words slip out before he can stop them. Their eyes meet briefly before both look away. Angela clears her throat. "Ms. Wells, the board is asking for an explanation. The stock price has fluctuated 3 points since this morning. Tell them I'm having my car restored. That's all they need to know." Catherine's voice carries the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "And call Maxwell. Have him send the usual cease and desist letters to any outlet publishing those. Old photos without permission." Frank watches this display of corporate power with a mix of admiration and disconnection. This Catherine, the one who can move markets with a word, seems far removed from the girl who once helped him rebuild a transmission on a hot summer night. "What about the shop?" he asks quietly. "I've got other clients to think about." Catherine's expression softens. "I'll have security posted, discreet but effective, and Angela will handle all press inquiries." She pauses. "Unless, if you'd rather I take the car somewhere else." "No." Frank's response is immediate. "This is still a place of business. We'll work around it." Tommy arrives for his afternoon shift, having to squeeze past the reporters outside. His eyes are wide. "Mr. Morrison, is it true? About you and Ms. Wells?" Frank looks at Catherine, sees the same question in her eyes. What is true about them? The past they shared, the decades spent apart. This strange new connection, built around the very car that first brought them together. "What's true," he says finally, "is that we have a Mustang to restore. And right now, the carburetor needs rebuilding. Want to learn how?" Tommy nods eagerly. And soon they're bent over the workbench, Frank demonstrating the delicate process of disassembly. Catherine watches them for a moment, then turns to Angela. "Clear my afternoon schedule. I'd like to observe the carburetor rebuild for quality control purposes." Frank hides his smile as he reaches for a wrench. Outside, reporters continue to gather, phones and cameras pointed at the shop. But inside, time slips back to simpler rhythms. The quiet click of tools, the patient work of restoration, and the careful dance of two people rediscovering how to exist in each other's orbit. Sarah arrives unannounced on Saturday morning, carrying a leather-bound album Frank hasn't seen in years. She's dressed casually for once, but her expression has the same focused intensity she brings to her legal cases. "Mum kept everything," she says, placing the album on Frank's workbench. "Every photo, every newspaper clipping, including these." She opens the album to a page Frank had forgotten existed. There's the old shop, circa 1969, with his father still at the helm. In the background, barely visible, a young Frank leans over, a familiar blue Mustang, while a dark-haired girl watches intently. "When were you going to tell me?" Sarah's voice is gentle but firm. "About you and Catherine Wells." Before Frank can answer, the shop door opens. Catherine walks in, followed by her ever-present assistant. She stops short at the sight of Sarah. "I'm sorry, I can come back?" "No," Sarah says, straightening. "Actually, I think it's time we met properly. I'm Sarah Morrison Chen." "Of course." Catherine moves forward, elegant even in what appears to be designer jeans. "I knew Frank had a daughter, but I hadn't realized how much I looked like my mother." Sarah's smile is carefully neutral. "I get that a lot." Frank watches the two women study each other. Sarah has Eleanor's height, her way of holding herself, but there's something in her direct gaze that reminds him startlingly of Catherine at that age. A fearlessness, a need to understand. "Angela, why don't you take an early lunch?" Catherine suggests. Her assistant hesitates, then nods, leaving them alone with the weight of unspoken histories. Sarah opens the album wider. "Dad never talked much about that summer. Mom did, though. Said it was when she first noticed him, watching him repair a certain blue Mustang every day after school." Catherine moves closer to examine the photos. "Eleanor Baker. She worked at the drugstore down the street. You knew her." "We all did. Small town." Catherine's finger traces the edge of a photo. "She was always kind to me, even after—" Frank clears his throat. "Sarah, this isn't—" "It is necessary, Dad." Sarah turns another page. "Because this isn't just about a car restoration anymore. The media's digging. They found Mom's obituary. The shop's history. They're trying to piece together a story." Catherine straightens. "I can have my team. With all due respect, Ms. Wells, your team can't control everything. People are fascinated by the idea of the billionaire and the mechanic. They're romanticizing it, creating narratives." Frank reaches for the album, turning to a particular page. "Show them this, then." The photograph shows Eleanor and Frank on their wedding day, both radiantly happy. In the background, at the edge of the frame, there's a glimpse of a blue Mustang driving away. "Your mother knew," Frank says quietly, "about Catherine, about that summer. She knew when she agreed to our first date, said the past was past, but we should honor it by being honest about it." Catherine's breath catches slightly. "I didn't know. I never sent a gift. I should have." "You were building your company," Sarah says. "Creating the future while we were here, preserving the past." She pauses. "That's what Mum called this place, a preservation of what matters." Tommy's voice carries from the doorway. "Mr. Morrison." The parts from Detroit arrived. "Come in, Tommy," Frank calls. "Family history lesson today." The young apprentice enters cautiously, sensing the charged atmosphere. His eyes widen as he recognizes Catherine, but he focuses on the album with professional interest. "Is that the shop in the old days?" Sarah smiles, making room for him. "That's my grandfather, Frank's dad. He started the business in '46 after the war." They gather around the album, 4 people connected by steel and memory. Tommy asks questions about old restoration techniques, his enthusiasm bridging the awkward gaps. Sarah shares stories of growing up in the shop, softening as she recalls Eleanor's constant presence, the smell of her coffee mixing with motor oil. Catherine listens intently, her corporate armor falling away. Once, when Frank glances over, he catches an expression of such longing on her face that his heart tightens. "Your mother was right," Catherine says finally, closing the album gently. "About preserving what matters. I spent so many years focused on innovation, on the future. I almost forgot the importance of remembering." Sarah studies her for a long moment. "The future needs roots," she says, echoing one of Eleanor's favorite phrases. "Maybe that's why you brought the car back here." Outside, the autumn sun plays. On chrome and glass, casting long shadows across the workshop floor, 4 decades of history lie open between them, captured in fading photographs and carefully preserved memories. The Mustang sits silent, witness, its partially restored body, a testament to the possibility of bridging past and present. The newspaper lands on Frank's workbench with a soft thud. Angela looks apologetic as she smooths out the business section, revealing the headline, Wells Innovations IPO approaches. CEO's past raises questions. The board called an emergency meeting, she explains. They're concerned about distractions. Frank scans the article, his eye catching on phrases like humble beginnings and questionable timing. There's a photo of Catherine leaving his shop, looking more human than her usual corporate portraits. The caption reads, "Wells spotted at vintage auto shop amid crucial pre-IPO period. She wants you to know she'll have to cancel her next few visits," Angela continues. "The investors are demanding her full attention." Frank nods, turning back. "To the Mustang's engine bay. Cars don't restore themselves. We'll keep working, but the corporate world isn't done intruding." Later that morning, a sleek town car delivers a man in an expensive suit, introducing himself as James Harrison, Wells Innovations' chief financial officer. "Ms. Wells is unavailable, but she asked me to check on the progress." His smile doesn't reach his eyes, and to discuss certain logistics. Frank wipes his hands. "The restoration's on schedule. About 30% complete." "Yes, about that." Harrison surveys the shop with barely concealed disdain. "The board feels that perhaps a more professional facility might be appropriate. Barrett Restoration in Los Angeles has offered—" "No," Catherine's voice cuts through the shop. She stands in the doorway, still wearing the power suit from her morning meetings. "The car stays here." "Catherine, be reasonable." Harrison turns to face her. "The IPO is in 6 weeks. Every decision, every association is under scrutiny. A small-town mechanic is the best restoration expert in California," Catherine interrupts, "and this isn't up for discussion." Frank watches the corporate drama unfold in his workshop, feeling like an observer in his own space. Catherine's authority is impressive, but he can see the strain around her eyes, the slight tremor in her usually steady hands. "The board meeting?" Harrison presses. "You left in the middle because you were trying to blindside me." Catherine's voice is steel. "This restoration project is personal. It's not subject to board approval." "Nothing is personal anymore, Catherine. Not with $20 billion in investments riding on the IPO. Harrison softens his tone. "Look, we can spin this. Successful CEO gives back to her hometown. One photo op, then we move the car to LA. Frank steps forward. "The car isn't going anywhere. Not unless Catherine herself tells me otherwise." He meets her gaze. Without corporate representatives present, Harrison opens his mouth to object, but Catherine raises a hand. "He's right. James, go back to the board. Tell them I'll handle this my way." After Harrison leaves, Catherine sags, slightly leaning against the workbench. "I'm sorry about that. The IPO, it's making everyone crazy." "Must be strange," Frank observes, "having your life dissected by stockholders. Everything becomes public property." She picks up the newspaper. "Every decision, every relationship, every old photograph someone digs up. You could stop it," Frank says quietly. "Take the car to LA. Make their lives easier." Catherine looks at the Mustang, its engine partially dismantled, parts carefully organized on Frank's workbench. Each piece labeled in his precise handwriting, each step documented in his leather-bound journal. "When I brought her here," she says finally, "I told myself it was because you're the best. And you are." She touches the car's fender gently. "But I think I needed this place, the reality of grease and metal and honest work, something solid in a world of virtual assets and market projections." Frank understands. In his world, things either work or they don't. Problems can be diagnosed, parts replaced, systems restored, no shareholders to please, no public image to maintain. "We'll keep working," he says simply. "The rest is just noise." Catherine straightens, CEO mask sliding back into place. "I have to go. Another board meeting." She pauses at the door. "Frank, thank you for understanding." After she leaves, Frank returns to the engine, losing himself in the familiar work. Outside, the corporate world spins on with its demands and expectations. But in here, time moves at the pace of restoration, patient, precise, and true to its own rhythm. Frank finds the letter while searching through old workshop records. He's looking for the original paint formula when a yellowed envelope slips from between faded invoices. His name is written in Catherine's precise hand, the ink faded but still legible. To be delivered to Frank Morrison, August 15th, 1969. The paper feels fragile in his hands, like a butterfly's wing. For a moment, he's transported back to that morning, arriving at the shop to find the Mustang gone, Catherine's father standing there with rehearsed words about Stanford and bright futures. The shop door chimes. Catherine walks in, looking exhausted from another day of corporate battles. She stops when she sees what he's holding. "Where did you—" "Found it in the old records." Frank holds up the envelope. "Your father never delivered it." Catherine sinks onto a nearby stool. "I wondered. When you never mentioned—" She takes a shaky breath. "Are you going to read it?" "Should I? It's 50 years too late, but—" She nods. "Maybe it's time." Frank carefully opens the envelope, trying not to damage the aged paper. Catherine's teenage handwriting flows across. The page, somehow both familiar and strange. "Dear Frank, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. Dad says it's for the best, that a clean break will hurt less. He showed me the ring you bought, told me about your plans for the shop. It would be a good life, Frank. Safe, secure, the kind of life most girls dream about. But I'm not most girls, and you know that better than anyone. There's something wrong with the computer in Dad's office, something that keeps calculating wrong no matter how many times they fix it. Last night I figured out why. I showed Dad my solution, and he showed it to his friend at Stanford. They're offering me a scholarship, Frank. Not just to study computers, but to help design them, to shape the future. Dad says I have to choose. The scholarship starts immediately. No deferrals. He's right that I can't ask you to wait, to put your dreams on hold while I chase mine. You belong here, bringing old cars back to life, preserving what matters. I belong somewhere else, somewhere I haven't found yet. I'm leaving the car. Dad wants me to sell it, use the money for school, but I can't. Maybe someday I'll understand why. Maybe someday I'll find the courage to tell you everything face to face. I love you, Frank Morrison. Enough to let you go, Catherine. The silence in the workshop feels heavy enough to touch. Frank carefully folds the letter, his movements deliberate. "Your father," he says finally, "told me you'd chosen to leave, that you didn't want any ties to hold you back." Catherine wipes at her eyes. "He thought he was protecting both of us, protecting our dreams." She laughs softly. "He wasn't entirely wrong. That computer problem, it became the foundation of my first patent, the beginning of everything I built. But the car—" Frank looks at the Mustang, understanding dawning. "You kept it all these years." "I tried to sell it, many times." Catherine stands, moving to run her hand along the car's fender. "But every time, I'd remember you teaching me about timing chains and valve clearances, about how every machine has its own rhythm, its own story." She turns to face him. "You taught me to listen, Frank, not just to engines, but to what matters. It's what made me different from other tech entrepreneurs. They saw only the future. I remembered this, the importance of understanding how things work, how they fit together." Frank thinks of the ring he'd bought, still stored in a box in his attic. Thinks of Eleanor, who'd understood his heart had been cracked but not broken. Thinks of all the paths a life can take, turning on moments as small as a computer glitch or an undelivered letter. "We all did what we thought was right," he says, echoing his words from their first meeting. "But now they carry a different weight, heavy with understanding rather than resignation. Did we?" Catherine's question hangs in the air between them, surrounded by the ghosts of their younger selves and the choices they made. The letter sits on the workbench, its long-held truth finally revealed. Outside, the world of IPOs and board meetings waits. But in here, surrounded by tools and memories, time moves differently, measured not in stock prices or quarterly reports, but in the slow healing of old wounds and the careful restoration of what matters most. The buyout offer arrives in a thick envelope marked with the Wells Innovations logo. Frank finds it on his workbench Monday morning, placed there by Angela before the shop opened. The document is 40 pages of legal language, but the essential message is clear. Wells Innovations wants to purchase the entire block for their new innovation center, with Frank's workshop at its heart. The number on the final page makes his hands shake. It's enough to retire comfortably, to help Sarah with Tommy's college fund, to travel and see all those places Eleanor always dreamed about. But it's the handwritten note, paper-clipped to the front, that truly catches his attention. "Frank, this isn't what you think." Read page 15, C. He turns to the specified page and finds detailed plans for the Morrison Center for Automotive Heritage, a combination classic car museum, restoration school, and working shop. His shop, preserved but expanded, modernized, but maintaining its soul, a bridge between past and future. The bell chimes. Mike walks in, newspaper tucked under his arm. "Thought I'd find you here early. You've seen the news?" Frank shakes his head, still absorbing the proposal's implications. Mike unfolds the paper to reveal the headline: Wells Innovations announces Sacramento Innovation Hub, Historic District, to be transformed. "They're buying everything," Mike says, settling into his usual chair. "The whole neighborhood. Coffee shops already agreed to sell. Maria's dad says they're letting him run it inside the new complex." Frank looks around. His workshop, seeing it through new eyes. The tools handed down from his father, the oil-stained concrete that holds decades of history, the warm light filtering through windows that have witnessed countless restorations. "Catherine wants to preserve it," he says quietly, showing Mike page 15. "Make it part of something bigger." "Smart woman." Mike studies the plans. "She understands you couldn't just walk away from this place. But Frank..." He hesitates. "Is this about the shop or about her?" Before Frank can answer, Tommy bursts in, face flushed with excitement. "Mr. Morrison, did you see? They want to make a school here, real restoration training with proper certification and everything." Frank watches his young apprentice's enthusiasm, remembering his own passion at that age. "You've been talking to someone about this?" Tommy looks sheepish. "Ms. Wells's assistant called last week, asked what would make the perfect restoration school. I didn't know it was for this." The door chimes again. Catherine enters, dressed casually in jeans and a simple blouse, looking more like the girl from '69 than the CEO worth billions. "I should have brought this to you personally," she says, gesturing to the proposal, "but I wasn't sure if I'd hear you out." Frank finishes. "If I had the right," she corrects. "This place, it's more than just a building to you. I know that better than most." Mike stands, nudging Tommy. "Come on, kid, let's get coffee. These two need to talk." After they leave, Catherine moves to the Mustang, now partly restored. The board wanted to level the whole block, build something sleek and modern, but I kept thinking about what you taught me that summer. About preservation, about keeping what matters. "So you designed this instead." Frank holds up the plans. "A museum, a school, a legacy," Catherine says softly. "Your legacy, Frank. Teaching new generations what you taught me, what your father taught you." Frank runs his hand along the Mustang's newly repaired fender. "And what about this? Once she's restored, she'll be the first exhibit. If..." Catherine hesitates. "If you'll agree to be the center's master restorer. Teaching, supervising, preserving more than just cars." The morning sun streams through the dusty windows, catching the metal tools and making them shine. Frank thinks of his father starting this shop after the war, of teaching Sarah to change oil when she could barely reach the hood, of Tommy's eager questions and quick learning. "I'd need complete control over the restoration program," he says finally. "No corporate interference." Catherine's face lights up. "Already in the contract. Page 28. And the name. Morrison Center sounds too..." "We can workshop it," she says quickly. "Whatever you want." Frank picks up a wrench, feels its familiar weight. "I'll need time to think it through. Of course. Catherine moves toward the door, then stops. Frank, this isn't about us. About what happened or didn't happen. It's about making sure what you've built here, what you know, it doesn't get lost. After she leaves, Frank sits at his workbench, the proposal open before him. Through the windows, he can see the neighborhood changing. Maria's father painting his coffee shop, the antique store across the street, putting up its everything must go signs, progress rolling in like an incoming tide. The question isn't whether change will come, it's whether he can help shape it, guide it, preserve what matters most within its flow. He picks up his phone to call Sarah. Her legal eye will be useful, but more than that, he needs to hear his daughter's voice as he stands at this crossroads between past and future. Frank holds the original paint chip up to the light, comparing it to the modern samples spread across his workbench. Even after 50 years, the Acapulco blue retains its distinctive shimmer, that custom pearl coat catching the morning sun just as it did in '69. That's it, Catherine says softly. She's been watching him work for the past hour, her laptop forgotten beside her. I'd know that color anywhere. They've fallen into a rhythm these past few days. Catherine arrives early before her corporate day begins, bringing coffee and memories. They talk about the car, carefully avoiding discussion of the buyout offer still sitting unsigned in Frank's office. The paint shop can match it, Frank says, making notes in his journal. But the real question is the pearl coat. That was custom work. You did it yourself. Catherine moves closer, her shoulder nearly touching his as she examines the chip. Mixed it by hand because I wanted something unique. The proximity stirs something in Frank's memory. I still have the formula. He moves to the old filing cabinet, pulls out a worn notebook. Inside, in faded ink, are the exact proportions. He'd used that summer. His handwriting was different then, younger somehow, but still precise in its measurements. You kept it all this time? I keep everything. Frank doesn't add that this notebook, these measurements, were particularly precious. Some technical details you hold on to, not knowing why until decades later. They bend over the notebook together, and for a moment, they're young again, a mechanic and a girl with dreams too big for a small town, creating something unique in the fading summer light. Tommy's arrival breaks the spell. He's carrying the chrome trim pieces they sent out for replating, each one wrapped carefully in soft cloth. Morning, Mr. Morrison, Ms. Wells. His enthusiasm hasn't dimmed since learning about the restoration school plans. If anything, it's grown. Want to see something cool? He unwraps the first piece, and even Catherine gasps. The chrome gleams like liquid silver, every curve and angle restored to its original glory. Frank runs a practiced finger along the surface, checking for imperfections. Perfect, he declares, ready for installation once the paint cures. Catherine checks her watch and sighs. I have to go. Board meeting about the IPO timeline. She gathers her things, then pauses. Frank, about the offer. Still thinking, he says gently. Some decisions need time. After she leaves, Tommy helps Frank lay out the chrome pieces in their proper order. The young man's hands are steady, his movements showing growing confidence. Mr. Morrison? Tommy carefully positions another trim piece. Can I ask you something about Ms. Wells? Frank concentrates on checking the alignment. What's on your mind? The way she looks at the car. It's like she's seeing something else, something from before. Cars hold memories, Tommy, especially ones like this. Frank picks up the paint chip again. Every restoration is part repair, part resurrection. We're not just fixing metal and chrome. We're bringing back moments. They work in companionable silence for a while, Frank teaching Tommy. The precise order of assembly. The way each piece needs to align perfectly with the next. The afternoon light plays across the chrome, casting bright reflections around the shop. Sarah drops by during her lunch break, ostensibly to discuss the contract's legal implications. But Frank catches her watching him work, sees questions in her eyes that have nothing to do with corporate law. You're different lately, Dad, she says finally, more alive somehow. Frank buffs a small smudge from the trim piece he's holding, just focused on the work. Is that what we're calling it? Her tone is gentle, understanding. Mom would want you to be happy, you know. Whatever you decide about the shop, about everything, she'd want that. The truth of her words settles over him, like the familiar weight of his old work apron. Eleanor had always understood the shop's importance, not just as a business, but as the heart of who he was. She'd understood about Catherine too, about the memory of first love and the way it shapes all the loves that follow. As the day winds down, Frank returns to the paint chip, holding it up one last time. Tomorrow, they'll start the final color coat, bringing the Mustang back to its original glory. But tonight, in the quiet of his workshop, he allows himself to remember that first time, the look in Catherine's eyes when she saw her car transformed, the way her hand had found his, the dreams they'd shared before life pulled them in different directions. The restoration is nearing completion. Soon, the car will be whole again. But some restorations go deeper than metal and paint, touching places that have waited decades to be made new. The press release lands on Frank's workbench like a bomb. Angela hovers anxiously nearby while he reads the draft, its corporate language attempting to soften what amounts to an inevitability. Wells Innovations announces comprehensive development plan, historic district to be modernized. There's no mention of preservation, no mention of the restoration center, just sleek architectural renderings showing glass and steel replacing brick and memory. There's been a change of direction, Angela says quietly. The board voted this. Morning. Ms. Wells was outvoted. Before Frank can respond, the shop door bursts open. Mike rushes in, followed by Maria and her father, and old Pete from the hardware store. Their faces tell him they've seen the news. They're not even giving. Most time to relocate properly, Maria's father says, his accent thickening with emotion. 90 days, they say. After 40 years. The bell keeps chiming as more neighbors arrive. Frank's shop becomes an impromptu community center filled with voices of protest and disbelief. These are the people who've defined his life. The coffee that fueled long restorations, the hardware store that always had that one odd bolt he needed, the customers who became friends. Tommy slips in through the back, face flushed. Mr. Morrison, there's reporters outside. They want to know if you've signed the buyout, if you're really going to let them tear down the shop. The door chimes again. This time it's Harrison, Catherine's CFO, flanked by 2 corporate lawyers. Mr. Morrison. His smile is professional, practiced. Perhaps we could speak privately. There's been a slight adjustment to the timeline. Anything you have to say, Frank replies. You can say in front of my neighbors. Harrison's smile tightens. Very well. The board has approved an expedited development schedule. We're prepared to offer a 20% premium over the original buyout figure for immediate possession. And the restoration center, the preservation plans. Market realities have necessitated a more forward-looking approach. Harrison produces a new contract. But we're confident you'll find the compensation more than fair. The shop falls silent. Frank feels the weight of every eye, every hope. He thinks of Catherine's vision for the Heritage Center, of Tommy's excitement about the school, thinks of his father starting this business with nothing but faith and skill. Where's Catherine? He asks quietly. Ms. Wells has recused herself from this aspect of the project. Harrison sets the contract on the workbench, given her personal connection. As if summoned by her name, Catherine appears in the doorway. She's still wearing her board meeting clothes, but her usual corporate polish is cracked. She takes, in the scene, the gathered community, the lawyers, the contract. I tried to stop it, she says, meeting Frank's eyes. Threatened to delay the IPO, but they had the votes. Of course they did. Frank's voice is gentle. Because you gave them that power, built something so big, it stopped being yours. Catherine moves further into the shop, her heels clicking on concrete. Frank, please sign the contract, take the money. I'll find another way to... To what? The question comes from Sarah, standing in the back doorway. to preserve what's already being destroyed. Harrison clears his throat. Miss Wells, the board was quite clear about your involvement. The board? Catherine's laugh holds no humor. The board exists because I built something they wanted to buy, because I chose that path. She looks around. The shop, at the half-restored Mustang, at the community gathered in protest. Because I left all this, thinking I had to choose. Frank picks up the contract, feels its weight. Outside, he can hear reporters gathering, cameras clicking. 50 years ago, another choice was made in this shop, another future chosen. You know what your father never understood? He says to Catherine. Why I taught you about cars that summer. He thought I was just sweet on you, the mechanic's son trying to impress the smart girl. Weren't you? I taught you because you wanted to learn, because you saw beauty in the way things worked. Frank sets the contract down, unsigned. That's what this place is. Not just repairs and restorations. It's learning, understanding, preserving what matters. Catherine stares. At the unsigned contract, then at Harrison's increasingly impatient face. Something shifts in her expression, the corporate mask cracking completely. The board exists, she says slowly, because I let them buy shares, because I wanted to grow faster, bigger. She turns to Harrison. But they don't own all the shares, do they? Catherine, Harrison warns, don't. I still control 43%. Her voice strengthens. And the trust I set up for educational initiatives controls another 12. The lawyers exchange glances. Harrison's face reddens. The development contract is signed. The permits can be challenged. Sarah steps forward. I'd be happy to help with that, Ms. Wells. Pro bono, of course. The community stirs, hope rekindling. Maria's father says something rapid in Spanish that makes his daughter smile. Tommy watches it all with wide eyes, witnessing corporate power confronting community spirit. Catherine meets Frank's gaze across the workshop, across decades of choices and consequences. I chose wrong once, she says quietly, standing in this very spot. I'm not doing it again. The alternative development proposal spreads across Frank's workbench, its pages weighted down by spare parts. It's been 3 days since Catherine's confrontation with the board, and she's spent every free moment working with local architects and preservation experts to create something new. See here, she traces a line on the blueprints. The Innovation Center wraps around the existing structures. We preserve the whole block's facade, but modernize the infrastructure behind it. History in front, future in back. Frank studies the drawings. The design is clever. His shop remains intact but expanded, with the restoration school occupying the adjacent buildings. The coffee shop keeps its corner location, and the hardware store transforms into a makerspace while maintaining its historic storefront. It's not just aesthetics, Sarah adds, pointing to another section. By preserving these buildings, we qualify for historical preservation grants. Tax incentives, too. The board can't argue with the numbers. They've turned Frank's office into an impromptu war room. Tommy runs in and out, carrying coffee from Maria's shop, where the community holds its own planning sessions. The whole neighborhood has rallied, offering expertise, suggestions, and support. The board meets tomorrow, Catherine says, straightening from the plans. I've called in every favor, leveraged every alliance, but I need one more thing. She turns to Frank. I need you to speak to them. Frank looks up from the blueprints. Me? They see this neighborhood as outdated, inefficient. They need to understand what we're really preserving. She meets his eyes. Will you help me show them? Before he can answer, Tommy bursts in. Mr. Morrison, the Mustang's paint is dry enough. We can start reassembling the chrome trim. Catherine checks her watch. The board meeting's not until tomorrow afternoon. Frank understands immediately. Tommy, get the trim pieces laid out. Sarah, call Harrison. Tell him we'll have a presentation he won't forget. They work through the night. Frank and Tommy carefully reassembling the Mustang's exterior, while Catherine and Sarah refine their presentation. The chrome goes on piece by piece, each component fitting perfectly into place. By dawn, the car gleams under the shop lights, its Acapulco blue paint deep and lustrous, the custom pearl coat catching every ray of morning sun. Catherine stands back, taking in the transformation. It's exactly as I remember. How did you? Because he never forgot, Sarah says softly. Any of it. Frank polishes a final fingerprint from the chrome. The question isn't just about preserving buildings or cars. It's about preserving knowledge, skills, the understanding of how things work and why they matter. Catherine touches the fender gently, careful of the fresh paint. The board thinks preservation is looking backward. They don't understand it's about carrying forward what matters. Show them, Frank says simply. The board meeting is scheduled. For 2 p.m. At 1:30, Frank pulls the Mustang out of his shop, its engine purring smoothly, every component restored to perfection. The chrome catches the sunlight, throwing bright reflections across the old brick buildings. The neighborhood turns out to watch. Maria's father brings coffee for everyone. Pete from the hardware store sets up chairs on the sidewalk. Even Mike shows up in his Sunday suit, ready to speak about the community's history. Catherine arrives, last, pulling up in her Tesla. She's dressed for corporate battle in a sleek suit, but when she sees the Mustang, her professional mask slips. It's not just a car, she says, running her hand along the perfect paint. It's proof that old and new can coexist. That preservation doesn't mean stagnation. Frank hands her the keys. The board should hear that from someone who understands both worlds. She takes them, their fingers brushing. Come with me, both of you? She looks at Sarah. I think the board needs to hear from the whole community. Sarah checks her briefcase, full of legal documents and preservation codes. They won't know what hit them. As they prepare to leave, Tommy approaches the Mustang reverently. It's the most beautiful thing we've ever restored. No, Frank says, watching Catherine slide behind the wheel with the same grace she showed 50 years ago. But it's a start. The Mustang's engine turns over perfectly, its restored voice carrying the sound of preservation done right. In its gleam, Frank sees the future Catherine is fighting for, one where progress doesn't mean forgetting, where what matters most is protected and renewed. She pulls away from the curb, heading toward corporate headquarters with Sarah beside her. Frank watches until they turn the corner, the morning sun making the Mustang's paint shimmer like a promise kept. The restored Mustang sits in front of Wells Innovation's gleaming headquarters, like a jewel from another era. Its presence draws employees to the windows, creates a ripple of whispers through the modern lobby. Even Harrison pauses when he sees it, his customary frown flickering with reluctant admiration. Catherine hands the keys to Frank before they enter the boardroom. Their fingers touch briefly, and he feels the slight tremor in her hand, not fear, but anticipation. Ready? She asks. The boardroom is all glass and chrome, 20 stories above Sacramento. 14 board members sit around a massive table, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Sarah arranges her documents while Tommy sets up the presentation slides they worked on all night. Before we begin, Harrison says, I must remind the board that this meeting is highly irregular. What's irregular, Catherine interrupts, is forgetting who we are and what we build for. She nods to Frank. Show them. Frank steps forward, conscious of his work clothes among their expensive suits. But his voice is steady as he begins. 50 years ago, I taught a young woman about engines, about the importance of understanding, how things work, not just what they can do. She took those lessons and built something extraordinary. He looks at Catherine, but she never forgot what she learned in that shop. The presentation flows from there. Sarah presents the financial benefits of historical preservation, the tax incentives, the community goodwill. Tommy, nervous but earnest, explains how the restoration school could create a pipeline of skilled technicians for Wells Innovation's advanced manufacturing division. But it's the before and after photos of the Mustang that capture the board's attention. The transformation is undeniable, proof that old doesn't mean obsolete, that restoration doesn't mean regression. The car is outside, Catherine says finally. I invite any of you to examine it, to see what real innovation looks like. Not just creating the new, but preserving the best of what came before. An older board member speaks up. It's impressive. Craftsmanship, certainly. But what does this have to do with our core business? With the IPO? Catherine smiles. Everything. Because today's innovation isn't just about technology. It's about sustainability, about bridging past and future. She brings up a new slide. The alternative development plans. This is what real progress looks like. The debate that follows is intense but measured. Frank watches Catherine in her element, handling objections with the same precision he brings to engine timing. Sarah fields legal questions with professional confidence, while Tommy's genuine enthusiasm for the restoration school concept proves infectious. Gradually, the mood in the room shifts. The board members start asking different questions, not about costs and delays, but about possibilities and potential. We'll need to revise the IPO documentation, Harrison admits finally. But the preservation angle could actually strengthen our market position, demonstrate corporate responsibility, community investment. Take a vote, Catherine says quietly. Let's make it official. The resolution passes 11-3. As the board members file out, many stop to shake Frank's hand. Several mention classic cars they'd love to restore. One even asked Tommy about enrollment in the future school. When the room is empty except for their small group, Catherine sinks into a chair, tension flowing out of her shoulders. "We did it," she breathes. "You did it," Frank corrects. "You found a way to preserve what matters while still moving forward." Sarah gathers her documents, sharing a meaningful look with Tommy. "We'll go check on the car. Take your time." Menzie, the sudden quiet. Catherine stands and moves to the window. The late afternoon sun catches the silver in her hair, reminding Frank of morning light on chrome. "I've spent 30 years in this room," she says softly, "making decisions that change the world. But this," she turns to face him, "this feels like coming home." Frank joins her at the window. Below, the Mustang gleams in the sunlight, a bridge between what was and what could be. "The restoration's nearly complete," he says. "Just a few final touches left. And then we start the next project." He meets her eyes. "The neighborhood won't restore itself." Catherine smiles, and in it he sees both the girl who left and the woman who returned. "I suppose I'll need an expert consultant for that work." "I might know someone," Frank says. "He's got experience with long-term restoration projects." The sun begins to set over Sacramento, painting the sky in shades of pearl and promise. In its light, the past and future seem to merge like fresh paint, blending perfectly with old, creating something both familiar and entirely new. 6 months later, Frank stands in the doorway of his expanded workshop, watching the morning light play across the newly restored neighborhood. The partnership agreement sits framed on his wall, not a corporate buyout, but a true collaboration between Wells Innovations and the community. The old buildings wear fresh paint and new purpose, their historic facades now housing a unique blend of past and future. Maria's coffee shop has doubled in size, but kept its worn wooden counter. Pete's hardware store shares space with a high-tech maker lab, teaching old crafts alongside new technologies. And at the heart of it all, Morrison's classic auto restoration anchors the Heritage Center, its doors open to both vintage cars and eager students. The bell chimes, the same bell, now hanging in a restored entryway. Catherine walks in wearing jeans and a Wells Innovations work shirt, her corporate armor set aside for their weekly restoration session. "Ready for the final test?" she asks. Frank nods, reaching for the Mustang's keys. They've saved this moment for a quiet Sunday morning, before the students arrive, before the world intrudes. The car sits gleaming in the morning light, every component restored, every detail perfect. Tommy emerges from the new training bay, wiping his hands. "Can I watch?" "You helped build it," Frank says. "You've earned this." Sarah arrives just as Catherine slides behind the wheel. She's carrying the old family photo album, its pages now supplemented with pictures of the restoration process, the community's transformation, the blending of two worlds. The Mustang's engine turns over, smoothly, its voice carrying the perfect harmony of restored machinery. Catherine eases it forward, guiding it out into the street where neighbors have gathered to watch. The morning sun catches the Acapulco blue paint, making it shimmer with memories and possibilities. Frank joins her for the test drive, settling into the passenger seat that still holds echoes of that long-ago summer. They drive through the restored neighborhood, past the seamless blend of old brick and new glass, past history preserved and future embraced. "The IPO papers are ready," Catherine says, as they cruise down familiar streets. Wells Heritage Division will be its own entity, dedicated to projects like this all over the country. "Teaching while preserving," Frank nods. Eleanor would have loved that. They park at the old drive-in site, now transformed into a community green space. The developer's signs are gone, replaced by plans for outdoor movies and gatherings. A piece of the past, reimagined instead of erased. "I got it wrong before," Catherine says quietly. "Thought I had to choose between past and future, between staying and going." "We all did what we thought was right at the time," Frank replies. "But now the old words carry new meaning. The trick is knowing when to restore what matters." Back at the shop, Tommy has his first student orientation. Young people fill the training bay, drawn by the promise of learning both traditional skills and cutting-edge technology. Sarah leads a community planning meeting in the new conference room, while Maria delivers coffee to both groups. The Mustang returns to its place of honor in the Heritage Center's main display. But it's not a museum piece. Catherine still drives it regularly, and Frank still teaches with it, showing students how classic engineering principles inform modern innovation. "One last thing," Catherine says, pulling an envelope from her jacket. It's his letter from 50 years ago, still unopened. "I think it's finally time." Frank takes it, feeling the weight of unspoken words and untaken paths. Carefully he tears it in half, then again. "Some things don't need restoring," he says. "They just need to be remembered so we can build something new." Catherine's hand finds his, her fingers still carrying the strength that built an empire, and the gentleness that never forgot where she came from. Outside, the morning sun touches old brick and new glass, making both glow with possibility. The bell chimes again as more students arrive, eager to learn the art of restoration. Frank and Catherine share a smile, understanding that some restorations go far beyond metal and machinery, reaching into the hearts of people and communities, bridging what was lost with what can still be found. In the end, it's not about choosing between past and future, between staying and going. It's about finding ways to carry forward what matters most, about understanding that the most important restorations aren't just about making things like new. They're about making them ready for whatever comes next, while honoring everything that came before.